Chapter 995, Conjoined Person. Emlyn glanced at Lon, raised his hand to pinch his nose, and chuckled. It appears you don't understand me. It's okay. A more simple description is to gather information about foreigners that come from the southern continent, especially from the Star Highlands and the Paws River Valley. What information do you want exactly? There are plenty of pure-blooded people from the southern continent in Backland. Those that you've mentioned are also common, Ian calmly asked without flaring up due to the contempt he received. Emlyn laughed. The ones that are a bit more abnormal. They do things in a fishy manner and seem to all be mysterious. You should understand what I'm getting at. There are definitely many people you describe. In Backland, they are either servants, workers, or thieves being part of gangs. As the latter will all meet your criteria of being abnormal, fishy, and mysterious. Ian sincerely pointed out how unpragmatic Emlyn's request was. Emlyn was already prepared for this. With an obvious smile, he nodded slightly. Then, give me all the information that meets those criteria. I'll do the filtering. Oh, I'll pay £50 as down payment for this commission as the standard fees for the early-stage investigations. The subsequent payment will be counted based on how much information of value is provided. Each one will cost £20. Who is the one to determine its worth? Ian asked after a few seconds of thought. For him, having a £50 income for preliminary work like this was enough for him to accept the job. It was more than enough to hire a dozen people or so to investigate the areas from East Borough to Cherwood Borough for half a month. He didn't mind how much he could only from the £50, as there were many people here who relied on him for their survival. He needed to arrange jobs with payment for them to do from time to time. Otherwise, he would never be able to be kept abreast with the latest developments. Emlyn sized up Ian and scoffed. Of course it will be me. You should know how trustworthy I am. Detective Moriarty never told me that. Ian mumbled and sighed. All right. Our last cooperation was still pretty good. I choose to trust you. Emlyn nodded in satisfaction, took out his wallet, and counted another £50 worth of notes. During this process, Emlyn momentarily felt the pinch when he realized he only had £407 in savings. And now there's only £357. He looked away from the notes and handed the cash to Ian. He didn't stay. Putting on his hat, he walked out of the billiard room and left the Bravehearts bar. On the street, Emlyn stopped pinching his nose and looked up at the flame-like clouds. His expression gradually fell heavy as he silently muttered, "That wraith from before isn't around. Where did it go?" Humph, Ian acted as though he had never heard of the Rose School of Thought, but his racing heartbeat had betrayed him. Also, he actually didn't ask if Sherlock Moriarty is back in Backland. He didn't even show any concern. Could it be that Sherlock has already returned to Backland and that he has already met him? Rorstad Archipelago, City of Generosity, Byam. In an area near the harbor, Admiral of Stars Catlia had brought along Frank Lee, who had his sleeves rolled up which revealed his brown hair, to an area outside a house with gas wall lamps. They came to an empty corner and watched as a figure appeared out of the shadows. It was bloodless Heath Doyle who was in charge of monitoring artisan Sealf. He was thin and his skin was so pale that it was transparent. He looked so frail that a gust of wind could topple him. Did anything strange happen recently? Catlia nudged the gold-rimmed glasses on her nose. Heath Doyle tersely acknowledged. 3 days after you left, a stranger visited Sealf. He stayed for about 15 minutes. I didn't approach for fear of being discovered. Based on your instructions, I sent men to tail the stranger, but they lost his trail. What did that stranger look like? Catlia asked with a slight nod. Heath Doyle took out a piece of raw beef from a leather pouch by his waist. The blood on it remained fresh, but it didn't show any signs of contamination. It appeared to be a pure piece of solid meat. Right on the heels of that, this piece of beef melted in Heath Doyle's hand, dripping to the ground like water. They then squirmed like they had life, drawing a portrait. This is the effect I want. Frank Lee's eyes shimmered as he watched this scene, expressing his intentions with excitement. Under his gaze, Heath Doyle had the intention to run, but he slightly slanted his body and pointed to the ground. Roughly like this. At this moment, a blood portrait had already taken form. It was that of a man with a mustache, with facial features that resembled that of the Paws River Valley. His greatest characteristic was the 3 ear studs on both his ears. Golden ear studs, thin body, not much fat, Very athletic, Heath Doyle added.
Katlia retracted her gaze from the ground and asked, "And then?"
Heath Doyle tersely acknowledged. No one visited Sealf after that, other than his temporary servants and chef he hired. I got men to investigate them. They are clean. Sealf has an evening stroll at a fixed time every day. He will bring a prostitute home, allowing her to leave only at daybreak. I've been constantly tailing him, but I never discovered any contact with odd people.
He has been acting very normally all this time?
Katlia asked with a frown. From her point of view, not having any abnormalities made it most abnormal. After all, this involved Rose's school of thought members that believed in the primordial moon. Heath Doyle nodded in affirmation.
Yes.
Katlia turned her head to look at the building's main door and said after some thought, I actually planned on using Beyonder powers to infiltrate and bring Sealf under control in the fastest speed possible before taking him away to prevent any accidents. But from the looks of it, the best solution is to knock on the door. Unknown danger was what terrified people the most. At the thought that he had been busy with his experiments recently and hadn't done his duty as first mate, Frank Lee hurriedly said, Captain, I'll go with you. Katlia took off her thick glasses and hung them by her waist of her black warlock robe before nodding. Okay. With that said, she left the shadowy corner and walked towards the main door of Sealf's residence. As she approached, she looked up at the crimson moon that could be seen penetrating through the clouds. She curled her fingers and tapped thrice on the door. Before long, footsteps approached and the door creaked open. Sealf didn't show any obvious changes from the previous time. He remained thin and dark. His eyes were somewhat puffy, and his brown eyes were trying hard to force a smile.
Admiral, is there something this time?
He stood by the door, blocking the gas wall lamp's light behind him. It made the area appear dark and gloomy, as though he was sinking into the shadows. Katlia stared at him for a few seconds before saying slowly, I have a new idea. I plan on making you a part of my crew. She stood there motionlessly without any intention of stepping inside. Sealf's expression warped as his voice turned somewhat dark. Why? Katlia's eyes seemed to freeze as she slowly said, Because I'm a pirate. Pirates didn't need reasons. They did whatever they did out of their own desires. Sealf's facial muscles twitched as a smile suffused his eyes once again.
I can be your sailor, but as an artisan, I'll be of much greater use in a city.
I agree. Katlia destroyed his resistance. But before then, I need you to spend some time on the future to be partners with others. Sealf's expression gradually turned cold as he replied in an ethereal voice. I'm afraid I won't be able to control myself. I have a strong urge to procreate every day. Strong urge to procreate. Frank Lee's eyes lit up as he asked, seemingly in confirmation. Sealf was taken aback as he wasn't sure whether to nod or shake his head. Frank then looked at Katlia and asked in excitement, Captain, is he going to be my assistant for my experiments? I love this trait of his. Katlia fell silent for a few seconds before nodding heavily. Yes. Frank immediately revealed a bright smile and offered his right hand to Artisan Sealf. Pleasure to meet you. Let me introduce myself. First mate of the future, Frank Lee. Sealf's expression returned to normal as he shook the man's hand with puzzlement. Then he said, Am I really going to spend a short period of time on the future? I guarantee it with my reputation on the line, Katlia sincerely replied before inwardly adding, It wouldn't take long before Her Majesty personally handles you. All right. It's not like I can beat you. Sealf shrugged. Please permit me to pack my personal belongings. He then took 2 steps back, turned around, and walked to the staircase at the end of the foyer. As he walked, he suddenly paused and said in an ethereal tone to Katlia and Frank Lee, Today's moonlight is as beautiful as it always has been, isn't it? Without receiving a reply, he proceeded forward and vanished from the staircase. At this moment, Katlia's heavy expression became obvious. After Sealf opened the door, she had already noticed an abnormality with her eyes. In the past, Sealf's spirit body was that of an ordinary human, but now, he was a conjoined person. Under the illumination of the moonlight, this conjoined person was being nourished and was rapidly growing stronger. This isn't a problem I can resolve. I have to write to Her Majesty. Also, I mustn't forget Gairman Sparrow's request for a meeting. Katlia sighed silently as she subconsciously looked up. High in the sky, a crimson moon remained bright and silent amidst the thin clouds. Backlund, Hilston Backlund. East Bala Military Veterans Mess. Dwayne Dantes and Mocked got off their separate carriages and entered the lobby together. Chapter 996 Card Game. After entering the East Bala Military Veterans Mess, Klein handed his cane and hat to his valet, Anuni, only to see Colonel Calvin of the Lone Kingdom's Ministry of Defense wearing an army uniform, waiting at the foyer with a glass of red wine in hand. This long-faced officer smiled as he raised his cup at Dwayne Dantes.
Long time no see. It really has been a while.
Klein smiled as he walked over. Colonel Calvin immediately offered his right hand. Congratulations. You did pretty well. Everyone was very pleased.
I was very pleased as well.
Klein used a lone-styled euphemism to express his pleasure in cooperating. He then shook hands with him.
Calvin retracted his arm and glanced at Mocked before he said with a laughing sigh, "Back when you first introduced Dwayne, I was quite distrustful of your judgment, but now I understand how you're a member of Parliament."
Anyone who interacts with Dwayne can easily tell that he's an expert at this. Mocked accepted the colonel's approbation with the same lone-styled euphemism. Calvin retracted his gaze, sipped some red wine, and smiled at Dwayne Dantes, asking in passing, "How much did you earn this time?" "Don't worry, I won't raise prices in the future because of it. I'm simply curious." 20,000 pounds in gold. Klein gave the midpoint value as an answer. In actual fact, he had earned 25,000 pounds, but after paying Miss Messenger 10,000 pounds for her services, he had only earned 15,000 pounds. Calvin nodded. "Not bad. If you need to convert those gold bars into gold coins, I can introduce you to someone from an Imperial Mint factory." "How was it? Did you notice anything abnormal around May Sanchez's area?"
Klein said directly without thinking. "Yes.
There was a place called Revival Square under his control that was destroyed by lightning."
"That I'm aware of," Calvin replied with a rather heavy expression.
"But you probably do not know that the person before you was the one who created the lightning." Klein smiled and then said, "Also, May Sanchez seems to be maintaining a fragile balance among many factions, but in actual fact, he has already secretly aligned himself with a particular faction. Of course, I'm not exactly sure who it is."
He had no intention of betraying the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom.
All he did was divulge a little to win the trust of the lone military. "The only thing that can be confirmed is that it isn't us," Calvin nodded and said with a deep look in his eyes. "It's unlikely to be Intis." Klein helped him eliminate one of the wrong choices. Calvin tersely acknowledged. "That isn't a bad thing either. The few factions surrounding May Sanchez are supported by Intis. If he wishes to expand, there's no way he can circumvent them. When the time comes, perhaps we will have more arms sales on our hands." With that said, he offered a toast. "Holy Lord of Storms, to riches for everyone." As believers of the Evernight goddess, Klein and Mocked smiled in response without giving a direct answer. After taking another sip of red wine, Calvin pointed at the second floor. "Dwayne, I brought you here today to play cards with a VIP. Texas Hold'em." "Which VIP?" Klein asked with piqued interest.
Calvin's expression turned solemn as he said with an unobvious smile, "Admiral Emerius.
He has been given a post and is currently in charge of the Ministry of Defense." Admiral Emerius. The admiral whose younger brother was stripped of his post as Governor-General, had his mistress corrupted by the Mother Tree of Desire, and ended up losing his post as highest commander of the Central Sonia Seas Navy? I've worked with him before and even pretended to be him for some time. Indeed, when it comes to a demigod, as long as they didn't screw up too badly, and if they are willing to hold it in, they will always be able to step out of the nadir. Klein recalled everything that had happened at Oravi Island, turning wistful. Towards Admiral Emerius Revolt, he still felt some guilt towards him. Although most of what happened back then didn't have anything to do with him, his mistress's anomaly was ultimately a result of the Mother Tree of Desire's wish to control him. That is to say that our future cooperation requires His Excellency's approval? Klein asked in enlightenment. That's how it is. Calvin nodded and pointed up the stairs. Let's head on up. When they arrived at the second floor, they stopped in front of a pair of dark red double doors. Calvin turned his head to glance at Dwayne Dantes. Your mission today is to lose money. Lose money? Klein sized up Calvin as he curled the ends of his mouth. I'll try my best. By the side, Mock said with a laugh. There's actually no need to be too deliberate. Admiral Emerius has excellent card-playing skills. It's almost impossible if you wish to win any money. Heh, I always lose. Sigh, I just hope I won't lose too much today. Otherwise, I wouldn't even dare to return home. Klein nodded thoughtfully. I only brought £200 in cash. Would that be enough?
Definitely not.
Calvin chuckled. I've already changed chips worth £1,000 for you. Just remember to return it. Loan's best lawyers only earn about £1,000 a year on the surface. You bunch of profligates. Klein sized up Calvin again. This colonel didn't notice it as he knocked on the door. After a while, the double door creaked open, revealing the scene inside. It was a hall paved with thick, soft carpets. There wasn't a lot of furniture, making it appear rather spacious. In the middle of the hall was a card table that could accommodate more than 10 people. Surrounding it were luxurious-styled high-back chairs. By the sides of the hall were gold-plated cutlery, marble-carved sculptures, coffee tables with books and newspapers, and a series of leather sofas. Klein looked over and saw Emerius Revolt sitting at the seat of honor. This admiral didn't look different from before. His black hair was neatly combed backward, with his blue eyes dark and profound. The corners of his lips drooped slightly, and his face was clean-shaven. He had an austere temperament, and he wore dark blue clothes with an epaulette. He was meticulous in every detail, appearing extremely serious.
When he swept his gaze, Klein found another familiar person.
He had thick but neat black brows with a short and hard crew cut of the same color. He had dark blue eyes and a high nose bridge with a bushy mustache spreading out from his mouth. He had a long face with accentuated outlines as well as callous curves. He was MI9's deputy director, Jonas Kilgore. He was one of the targets for Klein's return to Backlund.
He was the middleman in the dealings between the Demonist sect and a particular faction in the royal family. He was one of the accomplices of the Great Smog of Backlund. This brigadier general had abnormally broad shoulders, making his white shirt and black vest abnormally tight. He was playing Texas Hold'em with great focus. There are three demigods at a card table. How can this even be played? Interesting. Klein sat down and began observing the others at the table.
During this process, an attendant delivered a huge stack of chips, worth a total of £1,000. In the first few rounds, Klein folded after looking at his cards. He acted very cautiously, acting as though he never called or raised unless he had good cards. As for Admiral Emerius, his style was the complete opposite of him. He was in no way conservative. He called almost every round, constantly raising in an extremely aggressive manner. Every round that he was involved in seldom reached the point where everyone showed their cards. Most people failed to withstand such aggression and, with the Admiral's domineering force, they would call a round or two before folding. At times, someone would attempt to call Emerius Revolt's bluff, only to encounter 4 nines. The color in his face instantly drained as though he had been passed the death verdict by a judge. Jonas Kilgore had a completely different style as well. He would occasionally lose a round, but the chips lost wouldn't be much, preventing him from having too great a loss. And in the next round after his loss, he would often be able to wipe out the person who won all his chips the previous round, forcing him to spend money to buy in again. Is there a need? Why are you using powers to cheat when dealing with low and mid-sequence beyonders or even ordinary people? Others might not be able to tell, but would I be fooled? One has the Arbiter Pathways dominance, and the other has the Baron of Corruption's bribe.
Klein looked at his 5 of hearts and 9 of clubs as he shook his head indiscernibly.
He couldn't help but consider which powers of a seer pathway could provide him help if he wanted to cheat. Turn all my opponents into marionettes? In that case I can win as much as I want. I'm practically invincible, but it's of no pragmatic value. It's not like I'm planning for some deathmatch poker tournament. Unfortunately, there aren't any mosquitoes here. Otherwise, I can use their spirit body threads and turn them into marionettes to help me check out their whole cards. Faceless only allows me to change myself, not the cards. Magician's illusion? The effects would likely be pretty good when playing with ordinary people or low and mid-sequence beyonders. But there are 2 demigods here. Use a clown's ability to swap cards? It's useless. The dealing and shuffling of cards are done by the croupier. As his thoughts raced, Klein realized that apparently only his powers as a seer was of use here. He threw out his 2 whole cards to indicate a fold before taking out a metal chip and allowing it to move between his fingers. At this moment, Emerius Revolt suddenly looked up at him and retracted his hands before pushing all his chips in. Indeed.
Klein nodded inwardly without a hint of surprise. During his last cooperation, he knew that Admiral Emerius was able to distinguish ordinary people from Beyonders from his position. He suspected that he could even determine a Beyonder's level, or in other words their position. However, Klein wasn't too worried, because a Bizarro sorcerer had concealment powers to a certain degree. This was also why he could converge the augmentation effect the Grey Fog had on him after he reached Sequence 4. This made him confident that Emerius wouldn't be able to determine his level. However, he didn't attempt any corresponding interference, as he suspected that Emerius was able to tell that he was a Beyonder. Therefore he decided to reveal a tiny problem, making it easy to be seen through and be grasped. Chapter 997, Gambling God. Dwayne. The core rules of Texas Hold'em were very simple. It was to use 2 whole cards and 5 community cards to form a hand with any 5-card combination. Whoever had the biggest hand won. And the community cards were dealt in 3 phases. 3 community cards to form the flop in the first phase, a 4th community card called the turn in the second phase, and a 5th community card called the river in the third phase. Each phase allowed players to fold, check, call, or raise. This continued until everyone was done or until one person didn't fold. Klein fiddled with a chip in his hand as he divined the existence of any lucky instances within the next few rounds. However, he was unable to tell which exact round it was. After all, it was only a quick and simple divination with average effects. Using this method to play with ordinary people and low-sequence Beyonders wouldn't be a problem as long as the correct strategy is used, but it's definitely inadequate against demigods. It's already quite a challenge to defeat a mid-sequence Beyonder. Must I close my eyes each round and do a complete dream divination? Haha, if that were the case, Dwayne Dantes might end up with the title Sleeping Gambling God. Klein sighed inwardly. He continued watching the round play out as he sat by the side. At present, he had already lost a big blind and a small blind, tube/sup, when it was his turn. At this moment, Klein noticed one point. The MI9 deputy director, Konas Kilgore, had lost £20 to Admiral Emerius. A successful bribe. Admiral Emerius should be able to tell that Konas is using his powers as a baron of corruption, but he might not know that this MI9 deputy director is a demigod. The next round will be interesting. Hee. Klein jolted to attention as the new round began. He didn't check his whole cards when the croupier handed him 2 new ones. Instead, he placed the metal chip he was playing with in his hand onto his whole card, taking on the stance of not planning to look at them. After 2 people folded, the stern and old-fashioned Emerius Revolt casually took a look at his whole cards. After counting £5 worth of chips, he threw it into the middle of the table, having raised the stakes without garnering any surprises. Another person folded as mocked called. Right on the heels of that, Konas Kilgore, who had an unyielding personality, raised the stakes, throwing out a total of £20. Calvin confirmed his whole cards once again before calling. After one last person folded, Dwayne Dantes didn't do an actual count. He grabbed a handful of chips and threw it out. The croupier who was in charge of counting the chips glanced at it before precisely announcing Dwayne's action. £20. Call. I thought it would be £50. From the looks of it, I'm still not very used to these chips, the white-sideburn Dwayne Dantes with an outstanding temperament said with a laugh. However, he didn't add on the additional £30. At this moment, no one made a move. It was Emerius Revolt's turn again. This admiral didn't even glance at the remaining players. Picking up 5 £10 chips, he threw them out. Another raise. He didn't show any perturbations in his emotions, acting as though he was ordering a cup of black tea. However, that indescribable sense of dominance and the act of repeatedly raising the stakes pre-flop made the mood at the table freeze. Such situations often implied that Admiral Emerius had excellent whole cards. Perhaps they were a pair of aces or a pair of kings, or an ace and king. Mock decided to fold. Konas Kilgore rubbed his high-nose bridge and glanced around with his dark blue eyes before saying, "Call." Colonel Calvin confirmed his cards again. After 10 seconds of hesitation, he chose to fold. Dwayne Dantes touched the metal chip on his 2 whole cards and smiled. Call. After a round of expressing their intentions, there were only 3 players for the round. Then, the croupier flipped the 3 community cards in the middle of the table for the flop. 2 spade suit, 9 heart suit, K spade suit. The person who was up first was Admiral Emerius Revolt. He leaned forward slightly and said in a domineering manner, £50.
He had immediately raised the stakes to £50. Mocked, Calvin and company, including those who weren't in the game, felt stifled for some baffling reason. Konas Kilgore trembled slightly, but he ultimately grabbed £50 and threw it out. Dwayne Dantes glanced at the deputy director of MI9.
Completely unfazed by the pressure, he said with a smile, "Call." Upon hearing this, Calvin turned his head and nodded at Dwayne Dantes with his deep blue eyes that resembled a nighttime lake, indicating his approval. From his point of view, Admiral Amirius's domineering stance didn't affect a person who came to lose money. At this moment, the red-vested croupier revealed the fourth card, the turn. 9 spade suit. There were 3 spades, increasing the chances of a flush tremendously. However, Admiral Amirius still didn't hesitate. He calmly pushed a stack of chips. £100. Konas Kilgore's fingers tapped on his whole cards, showing his lack of confidence. But ultimately, he chose to call. Dwayne Dantes glanced at this deputy director once again and maintained his warm smile. Call. At this point in time, he had yet to see his whole cards, making Calvin somewhat worried. He believed that such an act was going overboard, a clear act of throwing money away. It wasn't something Admiral Amirius, who was relatively conservative, might find acceptable. At this moment, the red-vested croupier revealed the final card, the river, 2 club suit. As such, the community cards took form: 2 spade suit, 9 heart suit, K spade suit, 9 spade suit, 2 club suit. £200. Admiral Amirius pushed a pile of metal chips in with an extremely domineering attitude. Konas Kilgore took a deep breath before pushing 2 stacks of chips. £500. This amount of money was half of his purported annual salary. Is he trying to bluff? Calvin and Mocked exchanged looks, believing that Brigadier General Kilgore had made it too obvious, making it easy to see through him. One had to know that when playing Texas Hold'em, apart from doing risk management and probability calculations, it also involved psychological battles most of the time. Be it in terms of body language, expression, or the style used for raises, they made it easy to expose one's hidden cards. Of course, good players could also use these details to deliberately misdirect their opponents. Dwayne Dantes sized up Konas Kilgore before he laughed. Then, like the previous few times, he said, "Call." Amirius raised his hands, prepared to push all his remaining chips, to pressure his opponents into folding. At this moment, he suddenly paused. His deadpan expression wore a look of solemnity. After a few seconds of silence, he calmly said, "Call." At this point, the whole cards could be revealed to compare each person's hand. Admiral Amirius flipped his card first. It was an ace spade suit and 10 spade suit. It formed a flush with the 2 spade suit, K spade suit, and 9 spade suit. It was a rather high-ranking hand, with the only ones bigger than it being a full house, 4 of a kind, straight flush, and royal flush. "It's your turn," Amirius then urged Konas. Konas first flipped open a single card, K diamond suit. It made 2 pairs with the K and 9 from the community cards. Following that, he picked up his second whole card. At that moment, the remaining poker cards at the red-vested croupier's end blurred. Pa! The whole card was flipped open, revealing itself. 9 club suit. "What?" Mocked and company exclaimed, hardly believing their eyes. This meant that Konas Kilgore had obtained a full house. 9s over kings. It was bigger than a flush. "Sorry about that." "Full house." Konas looked at Amirius and said with a smile. Then, he turned to look at Dwayne Dantes. "You can reveal your cards." "I'm also very curious as to what my cards are." Dwayne Dantes smiled. He picked up the metal chip that he had placed down on his cards and very casually flipped the 2 whole cards. What? Calvin and company rubbed their eyes. Dwayne Dantes's whole cards were a very weak pair, 2 heart suit, 2 diamond suit. There happened to be a very small pair in the community cards, 2 spade suit, 2 club suit. They formed a 4 of a kind, the smallest rank when it came to 4 of a kind, but it was higher rank than all the full houses. Praise the lady. Dwayne Dantes drew the crimson moon across his chest in pleasant surprise, looking as though he had never expected it. An interesting round. Amirius was taken aback for a moment before he gently clapped. Konas Kilgore gave Dwayne Dantes a deep look and said with a laughing sigh, I never expected the final winner to be you. Klein wiped the smile from his face as he inwardly grumbled. It's only right that I win over the two of you. On the one hand, Admiral Emirius enjoys pressuring others and doesn't really rely on his Beyonder powers to cheat. As for you, you placed your focus and Beyonder powers on Admiral Emirius, thus ignoring me. On the other hand, the one playing cards with you is actually named Winner Anuni. Without even looking at his whole cards, it was obvious that he was relying solely on luck. At the moment he placed his chip on the whole cards, Klein had already swapped positions with Anuni as they switched faces with each other. Although Colonel Calvin had gotten him to deliberately lose £1,000, Klein decided to win a killing after he saw Kona's Kilgore. This wasn't because he couldn't bear to part with the money. Instead, his main motive was to garner the attention of this Mi-9 demigod. He wanted to get familiar with him and build relationships. Only by doing this could Klein have an opportunity to obtain intelligence from Kona's Kilgore, and even carry out an assault on him. After all, he was a demigod. To deal with him in Backlund required sufficient care and caution. He would rather give up an operation if he lacked the confidence to guarantee a kill or lure him away from Backlund. Otherwise, he was bound to expose himself, ending up being surrounded by demigods and even angels in Backlund. In the subsequent rounds, Klein won and lost different rounds. In the end, not only did he keep his £1,000 in chips, but he had even won nearly an additional £1,000. During this process, Calvin had gestured to Dwayne Dantes to lose, but he was left stupefied by the latter's ridiculous good luck that left him undefeatable. After the game came to an end, a person walked over to Dwayne Dantes with a smile. Kona's Kilgore. 1 big blind is equal to the minimum bet. 2 the small blind is normally half the big blind. Chapter 998 Establishing Relations with Dark Blue Eyes. Kona's Kilgore, who had crew-cut hair which was seldom seen among members of high society, held a cup of champagne as he walked up to Dwayne Dantes. He said with a smile, "You had great luck today. You also had plenty of courage." One if he's referring to me immediately folding after receiving a bribe, with me rather losing a big blind, that's not luck but knowledge. As for the other times, playing cards with all of you has pretty much drained all of Anuni's recently accumulated good luck. Klein swirled the cup with pale golden alcohol in his hand and said with a laughing sigh, "For a person who doesn't care about the outcome, there's naturally nothing to fear." Heh, praised the lady. He was using a loan-style euphemism to indicate that he was mainly here to lose money, and that his good luck was all thanks to the blessings of a deity. It had nothing to do with himself. Kona's hadn't lost much tonight, approximately £100 to £200. Although this was already a considerable amount when compared to his purported salary, to a Brigadier General Deputy Director of Mi-9, a hidden demigod, his salary was the most trivial part of his income. Therefore, he didn't mind it. He shook his head with a smile. Humans often have no way of seeing through the arrangement of fate. You are an interesting person. It's a pleasure to meet you. His final sentence was both a form of praise and also a part of the formalities. It indicated that their conversation was over. However, Klein had acted all night to acquaint himself with this demigod of the Black Emperor pathway, so how could he give up? He first replied, "It's my pleasure as well." Then, he asked in a seemingly random manner, "Your Excellency, are you familiar with the manors in the Backlund suburbs? It's best if they come with forests for hunting." According to the information Klein had received from Miss Justice, Kona's Kilgore didn't enjoy holding banquets, balls, or saloons at his place. Neither did he accept invitations on such matters. It was unknown if it was a problem with his character or due to his job. He had very simple hobbies. First, he enjoyed smoking cigars, especially Chieftain cigars from East Balham's Mike, recognized as the best cigars in the world. Second, he enjoyed playing cards, especially Texas Hold'em. Third, he enjoyed hunting. He often headed to the Backlund suburbs during autumn and winter. He even headed to Awa County or East Chester County for hunting. Klein was already planning on buying a manor, an expenditure meant solely to integrate himself into high society. He hadn't made any decisions yet, but after meeting Kona's Kilgore today, he suddenly added this request in a bid to garner his interest. When the time came, he could even invite this Mi-9 deputy director to hunt in the suburbs over an enjoyable weekend. He could then seek out an opportunity to take action. Kona's Kilgore drank a mouthful of champagne and said after some thought, "I'll help you take note of it. If there's anything suitable, I'll send someone over. Backlund Street, right?" "Yes,
Someone will inform you there. Thank you very much, Klein earnestly replied. At the same time, he pitied his former valet, Richardson, who had now become an assistant butler. This young man who wished to better himself recently went out early in the morning and returned late at night. He had been gathering information about manors in Backlund's suburbs, filtering out those that met the requirements and the ones which were on sale. He had been personally visiting them in a bid to list down options which were all flawless. He didn't wish for his employer to spot something he fancied only to find out that it wasn't for sale, or that the actual conditions were far worse what was described. And after Klein suddenly changed his request, all the work that Richardson had done was undoubtedly made useless. The all-evil party in contracts always changes their requirements and requests. Yes, after this is done, I'll get Tanaja to raise his annual salary by £5. As an assistant butler, he should naturally earn more than his time as a valet. £5. It was gone in just 1 or 2 raises in today's game. Richardson's annual salary is only enough to play a few rounds of Texas Hold'em. Klein sighed inwardly when he sensed eyes looking at him. He directly looked back and realized that it was Admiral Emerius Revolt. This old-fashioned and stern middle-aged man nodded gently and retracted his gaze. He had no intentions of communicating with Dwayne Dantes, nor did he get anyone to arrest this unaffiliated beyonder. After all, he was considered a working partner of the military, and it wasn't rare for a merchant, an adventurer with wide connections, to be able to obtain a potion. At this moment, Colonel Calvin and Member of Parliament Mocked walked over to Dwayne Dantes with wine glasses in hand. What happened? Calvin asked with an exasperated and suppressed voice. As Dwayne Dantes had won nearly £1,000, he and Mocked had to change their strategies to prevent Admiral Emerius from losing any money. They went from a tight strategy to an unrestrained one. They felt quite the pinch from losing several £100 each. As such, adding to everyone's losses, Admiral Emerius had won a total of nearly £300. With regards to this, Klein spread his hands. I didn't even look at my whole cards. In between the lines, he meant that this was simply the blessings of some deity that controlled luck. At the moment, the deities, angels and secret existences who had authority in the fate domain included, but were not limited to, the Evernight Goddess, the Fool, Snake of Mercury Willosepton, Pallas Zoroast, Blasphemer Ammon, and Snake of Fate Ouroboros. This is really such a vexing matter, Mocked said with a bitter smile while shaking his head. Calvin and I don't even dare to return home after what we've lost. They had roughly lost about half their purported annual income. Dwayne Dantes, with grayed sideburns, revealed a surprised look. When did you guys lose? He then pointed at the pile of chips at his seat. I just happened to retain the £1,000 I bought in at the beginning. The rest are yours, isn't that so? 1. Calvin and Mocked were taken aback as they exchanged looks. Then they revealed smiles. We must have counted wrongly due to the anxiety. Calvin gave an approving nod. Klein laughed and immediately changed the topic. He then began looking at supper that was placed on the coffee table beside him. City of Silver, in the spire of one of the Twin Towers. Derek Berg once again met the chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad. You said that you have something you would like to ask me about? Colin, who had quite a number of old scars on his face, calmly asked the youth who wasn't considered too tall. Derek bowed and replied frankly, Yes, Your Excellency. In the advancement for Priest of Light, I need pure darkness, but once I do it, it will be extremely dangerous. I'm wondering if there are any solutions. Colin Iliad listened seriously before nodding. You have to confirm one point. Is it pure darkness, or darkness with zero light? These two concepts are very different. If it's the latter, you can obtain that in the Spire's underground dungeons. You've been there for some time, so you should know what I'm talking about. Derek had a deep fear for the Spire's dungeons because it was there that he first met Blasphemer Ammon. Not only did he see the former captain of the expedition team, but he had even been parasitized. Unless it was necessary, he really didn't wish to recall it. At this moment, after receiving the chief's reminder, he began to slowly jolt his memories. He discovered that, under the spire, although each cell was given candles, one would have to wait for the guards to deliver food and medicine and ask for more once they finished burning. This didn't happen frequently, with it happening only thrice a day with the gaps in between being very long. And in such an environment, phenomena like the appearance of monsters and the vanishing of humans never appeared. Derek recalled that he had been in darkness with zero light for some time without encountering any danger. He pondered for a moment and hesitantly said, "The darkness with zero light at the bottom of the spire has external powers involved?" It was this power that prevented the darkness from making people disappear or producing monsters. Colin Iliad looked at the two swords that were hung up in a cross-like fashion on the wall. He looked up and sighed. Yes, that's why it's called darkness with zero light, not pure darkness. Derek frowned slightly as he tried to recall. After a few seconds he said without certainty, "If that's the case, the darkness outside the spire's basement isn't pure darkness as well. In many historical records, the nights before the Dark Ages didn't make people vanish or produce monsters. Now, the darkness must have undergone an abnormal change or had some other forces mixed into it to turn it dangerous." Not bad. For you to make such connections shows that you've improved. Therefore, let me ask you again. Do you need pure darkness or darkness with zero light? Colin's light blue eyes revealed a hint of surprise. Could it be that pure darkness only exists outside the forsaken land of the gods? Derek turned gloomy before he pumped himself up. Your Excellency, I'm not too sure either. I'll take some time to confirm this. He believed that the experienced and strong Mr. Hanged Man, Mr. World, and the other members of the Tarot Club could give him a good solution. Colin Iliad didn't ask further as he said with a nod. Go on then. Once you reach Sequence 5, even if you aren't able to become a demigod for a long period of time, you will have the chance of wielding certain sealed artifacts. 1 Backlund, Hillston Borough, Zio changed into a brown jacket and wore a cap, pretending to be a very ordinary short man. She had officially taken the commission and had begun tailing and investing the gentleman named Ernst Boyar. There were also a few other bounty hunters who participated in this mission. Ernst Boyar lifted his top hat and pointed his cane forward as he instructed the carriage driver, to St. George Borough. It was southeast of Backlund, separated from East Borough by the Tussock River. Once he got on his carriage and took his seat, Ernst sniffed. He looked out the window and suddenly grunted. As a sanguine viscount, how could he not have discovered the clumsy bounty hunters tailing him? Chapter 999 Instigation. When Ernst left on a carriage, the few bounty hunters hiding in the vicinity immediately appeared. Without being stingy about the costs involved, they immediately stopped any rental carriages that passed by. Some memorized the target carriage's traits and attempted to take shortcuts through the cramped, isolated paths to catch up to it. Others rode on the bikes they had prepared ahead of time, swerving through the crowds and carriages with their bells ringing. It was very easy for them to keep pace. Among them, only Zio was completely composed. She remained in her spot, watching Ernst and her peers leave. This transportation tool known as a bicycle is more useful than I imagined. It's no wonder so many bounty hunters have saved up to buy one. This can save expenses from taking carriages and save time walking. If one often has such tracking missions, then the money saved is enough to buy a brand new bike. The only problem is that this mode of transportation tool has very few models available. All of them have high seats. Zio was enticed. At this moment, a tracked carriage drove over from the crossroads and stopped in front of her. Zio happened to be at a station. Glancing at the double-decker that stopped on the iron tracks, Zio took out a few pennies, walked over, and sat down by the window. Such public carriages could seat nearly 50 people with its double decks. It wasn't too crowded, allowing Zio to easily observe the scenery outside. However, she didn't admire the scenery. Her mind was quickly outlining the exact appearance of her target. Brown hair, red eyes, pronounced features, a nose bridge that was so high that it looked deformed, and an oil painting catalog in hand. With her supernatural senses as a sheriff, as well as the distance between them not being too great, Zio could vaguely grasp her target's current location and predetermined destination. Therefore, she remained very calm and even took off her cap while using the glass windows to tidy up her coarse and stubborn blonde hair. After several stations, Zio suddenly got up when the public carriage came to a stop as she alighted. This was the Backlund Bridge area. She had sensed that the target had already changed direction, and was preparing to head towards the bridge. Zio immediately went on foot, planning to enter another street at the bend up ahead to board the public carriage that headed for the south bank of the Tussock River. She had good luck, with a public carriage driving over just as she arrived at the stop. Zio silently exhaled and took out another batch of pennies she had prepared. Her urge to buy a bike strengthened. This tracked carriage was very crowded, but with her domineering aura as an arbiter, She was able to easily pass through the crowd, head up to the upper deck, and find a seat. The carriage moved slowly as Xiao casually looked out the window when her gaze suddenly froze. She saw Sherman, who she hadn't been able to find anywhere.
This young man who thought himself as a woman was carrying a paper bag with a few long loaves of bread and a stack of newspapers as he entered a narrow alley.
His brown shoulder-length hair had grown longer, and his gray patterned trousers seemed tighter. Although his figure disappeared almost as quickly as he appeared, making it impossible for the average person to notice, Xiao, who was a sheriff, easily made the necessary judgment. Sherman stopped renting his place in Eastborough and moved here? Seeing that Sherman was fine and that she was still tracking her target, she held back her urge to jump off the carriage to chase after him to ask him about his recent situation.
Sherman carried the paper bag with several long loaves of bread and a stack of papers as he passed through alleys and streets, making a huge detour before entering an apartment building.
He followed the cramped stairs to the third story, took out a key, and opened the door to where he lived. He seemed to possess some pretty good anti-tracking skills.
With a creak, the door opened as Sherman's eyes lit up.
He saw a lady wearing a black dress in front of him. This lady had a sweet, supple face and an impeccable figure. Even while standing at the window and blocking out the sunlight, making herself become cloaked in the shadows, she seemed to be gilded, making her appear holy and beautiful.
"Why are you here?"
Sherman stared at her in surprise but couldn't help but size her up. His unobvious Adam's apple bobbed up and down as he swallowed a mouthful of saliva.
The next second, he turned his head and looked to the side as though he didn't dare look at her head-on.
"Ma'am T. Trissy," Sherman stammered a greeting.
Trissy slowly smiled as she allowed the poorly lit room to appear to become brighter. Then she asked with a teasing tone, "Why don't you dare to look at me?"
I don't know. I won like men.
Why do I still have odd thoughts when looking at you?"
Sherman continued looking at the ground to his side as he stammered an answer. Trissy's expression immediately turned mixed before smiling as though nothing had happened. Females can also appreciate the charm of beauty within their gender. She paused for a moment before saying, "I came here today because I have a mission for you. Your original progress has been very fast, leaving me very satisfied. But it seems like it has recently stopped." Sherman's face immediately wore a look of horror as he subconsciously took a step back.
I don't think there's a need to do such things." Seeing Trissy silent, Sherman's gradually eloquently stringed his words.
"I really don't wish to instigate others into stealing, robbing, and murdering. That's too evil, too despicable. Even at the very beginning, those people you got me to assassinate seemed to be a little overboard. Although they had indeed cursed me, beat me, ostracized me, and spread bad rumors about me, using all kinds of means to harm me in exchange for joy, their actions didn't require them to pay with their lives." Unsurprised, Trissy smiled and said, "That's not what you said back then. You hated them and had wicked feelings for them. Once you obtained beyonder powers, you were so eager to seek revenge on them. I just made a tiny suggestion, and you planned several assassination missions. I always remember how you looked stained with blood, trembling in excitement and fervor." Sherman couldn't help but retreat as he heard that until he was stopped by the door which had closed at some point in time.
He then covered his face with his hands, shouting, "No!
I have nightmares every night, dreaming of them surrounding me, covered in blood. They chase after me, bite me." "Pa!" The paper bag fell to the ground as the long loaves of bread were scattered. The stack of newspapers happened to drop just beside them.
"This is very normal."
Trissy cut off Sherman. "This is a necessary psychological change for an assassin. Think about it. Didn't you wish to kill them when they were bullying you?" "Yes," Sherman answered hesitantly. Trissy then chuckled. "Just treat it as self-defense when being bullied, thus killing them."
Her speech had a natural allure that made one wish to listen and believe.
Sherman rapidly calmed down and nodded. "From this point of view, it does seem much better." Upon hearing that, Trissy's dimples appeared as she teasingly added, "Besides, they weren't your match when they were alive, so what's there to be afraid of when they're dead? Even if they become ghosts or specters, it's nothing. You just need to seriously complete the ritual and consume one more potion, and then you'll be able to burn all those souls to oblivion. But I can't bear seeing people turn ugly, crazy, and evil under my acts of instigation." Sherman still seemed rather unwilling.
Trissy indiscernibly curled the ends of her lips as she said with her smile maintained, "Those are evil thoughts they had to begin with."
"It has nothing to do with you. Even without you, Those evil thoughts will erupt at specific moments and situations. Also, the missions I arranged for you are all related to the gangs. Aren't you most aware of what those people are like?
Getting them to fracture and kill one another is mercy and kindness for people like you and the innocent people of Eastborough.
Sherman subconsciously widened his mouth, swallowing the words he was just about to say. He instantly fell silent.
Trissy's eyes swept past him and continued with a soothing voice. You're just one step away from your target.
As long as you complete the remaining ritual, you can drink the third potion to completely become a woman. When that happens, you can use the name Shermaine that you've already picked for yourself. What a nice-sounding name it is, isn't it? Then, you can leave Backland as a woman, heading for Mid-Seashire or Desi Bay where you can begin a brand new life. You will no longer have anything to do with this place. Yes, you will definitely be filled with charm. Many excellent men will court you, and you can choose the one you like the most and are most satisfied with, walking down the aisle in a cathedral. You will have bubbly kids, and you can bring them up to be healthy children. You can bring them to Winter County for skiing, Desi Bay for holidays, and to the hunting grounds which are pleasures that only nobles have. Didn't you say that you were willing to do anything to regain your true self? Sherman's lips quivered, and after pursing them tightly for a while, he separated them and said, Ma'am Trissy, I understand. I will proceed according to your instructions.
After saying that, he seemed to lose all his strength as he stumbled to the ground.
He subconsciously reached out to hold onto a coat rack beside him. During this process, his gaze happened to sweep past the stack of newspapers. It had already spread apart, revealing a particular report. Tycoon from Desi Mr. Dwayne Dantes shows interest in purchasing the Larryway Steel Company, believing that it has excellent profitability and a promising future. Sir, are you really planning on buying Larryway Steel Company? Anuni asked while walking upstairs at 160 Buckland Street. Dwayne Dantes shook his head and smiled. That news is just pure fabrication. I've only met the owner of the Larryway Steel Company, Mr. Phil LaRivie, at a ball last week and had a chat.
By the side, Butler Walter heaved a sigh of relief as he warned, Sir, the Larryway Steel Company is indeed seeking a buyer.
There are quite a number of people who are considering the option. That also means that this piece of news was released by the reporters under Phil's instructions so that he can sell it at a better price? Klein nodded in thought.
He entered the room with a half-balcony and prepared to head up above the grey fog.
He wanted to use Anuni's praying point of light to see any abnormalities at Hazel's place. This was something that he had been doing daily for the past few days. Chapter 1000 Prelude in the Grand Palace above the grey fog. Through Anuni's prayer point of light, Klein saw the scene inside his valet's room. As his vision pulled out and slowly extended out, he began taking in all of Buckland Street. Among buildings covered in fresh flowers and grass, Intis parasol trees that shielded the sunlight slowly swept past. There were slow-moving carriages that were elegantly or beautifully adorned, and youths dashing quickly on bikes. Finally, Klein locked onto Unit 39, Member of Parliament Mocht's residence. He then lowered his field of view and began observing every animal and human to see if there was any black-haired, black-eyed, monocle-wearing man. Phew! There's no switching or grafting of fate. Nearly 10 minutes later, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. At this moment, a carriage drove into Mocht's residence and stopped at their doorstep. A young lady with curly black-green hair and bright, dark brown eyes alighted from a carriage. It was none other than Hazel who had returned home. She was wearing a dark green dress that didn't expose her shoulders. Her lips were slightly pursed, and she wore a relaxed look with a hint of joy. Upon seeing Hazel in such a state, Klein's heart skipped a beat. This was definitely abnormal. From Klein's point of view, the rat demigod had only two outcomes after meeting Amon's avatar. She either had a trump card and managed to escape successfully at the cost of being heavily injured, or she had turned into a beyonder characteristic to strengthen Amon's avatar. And regardless of the outcome, there was no way Hazel could find her teacher. She would definitely be in grief and pain, feeling dispirited and sad. So how could she be relaxed and happy? With her taking the risk to head to the manor in the suburbs to inform her teacher, she's not a cold and selfish person. Her present state indicates that she has confirmed that her teacher, that rat demigod, is fine. She has even been rewarded, perhaps obtaining all kinds of knowledge about the supernatural world. This is in conflict with my theory of the rat demigod's outcome. No, it's not in conflict. Once you eliminate the impossible, Whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. Klein leaned back into his seat and came to a conclusion. Amon had not only obtained the rat demigod's beyonder characteristic, but he had also stolen her fate and had replaced her identity. Therefore, to Hazel, her teacher hadn't encountered any mishaps and would only need a period of time to lie low. After making the confirmation, Klein silently exhaled and felt a little relaxed. To him, the most terrifying aspect of Amon was that no one knew what form or identity he would use to appear. It could be possible that Member of Parliament Mocked would one day wear a monocle, or that insects in the garden would turn around with monocles on their faces. Therefore, after grasping the identity Amon might use to appear, Klein couldn't help but feel more assured. As for Amon's performance being problematic in front of Hazel, Klein believed that it was impossible. After all, Amon was a king of angels that was fundamentally good at deceit. Even if he mentioned something that differed from what the rat demigod had said, he could easily use the excuse of it being a test with what he now said being part of her formal education to fool her. Of course, based on Palez Zorost's depiction, Amon definitely wouldn't appear as a rat demigod, so I shouldn't be careless. Klein did some observations before retracting his gaze and leaving the gray fog. Inside his room, he sat on a reclining chair and drank some black tea with a lemon slice. He half closed his eyes and considered how he could deepen his relationship with Kona's Kilgore. After an unknown period of time, Klein suddenly opened his eyes and activated his spirit vision. At the demigod level, he could already activate it at will. Almost at the same moment, Rionette Tinker walked out of the void with the 4 blonde red-eyed heads in hand. One of them had a letter in its mouth. "Whose letter is it?" Klein asked as he reached out his right hand. "Sharon," Rionette Tinker's other head answered. "Miss Sharon? She should be making her final preparations for the advancement. Why would she suddenly write to me?" Klein was slightly puzzled as he received the envelope. After he opened it, he found very little content. There was only a simple line: Emlyn White is seeking out the Rose School of Thought. Emlyn is seeking out the Rose School of Thought? Klein pricked up his brows in surprise. His opinion of Emlyn was a sanguine who was afraid of trouble. Unless necessary, he didn't even wish to head out. So how could he actively search for the Rose School of Thought? This definitely isn't Emlyn's own will. Yes, Emlyn had mentioned that some important figure of the Sanguine was meeting him. This is a new mission that the Sanguine gave him? It's very possible. However, why didn't he mention it in the Tarot Club? Oh, it was focused on the punishment operation, and he had other clues, so he temporarily kept it from us? Klein thought as he leaned forward. Under the watch of Miss Messenger's 8 eyes, he took out a piece of paper and a fountain pen from his coffee table. He wasn't curious about Emlyn's clues, because it was an obvious matter. Since Miss Sharon knew that Emlyn was seeking out the Rose School of Thought and had asked their mutual friend, Detective Sherlock Moriarty, about this matter, it meant that this Sanguine had likely asked the help of the black market arms dealer, Ian, from the Bravehearts Bar. This also meant that, in Emlyn's previous commissions, he must have noticed Sharon or Marek. Otherwise, it was impossible for him to mention the Rose School of Thought to an ordinary person. I don't know enough about the apothecary pathway. I can't determine how Emlyn discovered a wraith or zombie. Klein crossed his right leg as he placed the letter on his thigh and began scribbling. This is likely a mission the Sanguine's upper echelons gave Emlyn. They hate the Rose School of Thought members who believe in the primordial moon, and they have directed this anger at the other factions of the Rose School of Thought. Upon writing this, Klein paused and added, I suspect that the Mother Tree of Desire has the intention of encroaching onto the authority of the Moon Domain, but I'm unsure why the primordial moon believers would join the Rose School of Thought. This secret existence seems to have a very complicated relationship with the Mother Tree of Desire. They are at odds, but they have also cooperated. It's hard to tell. Putting down his pen and folding the letter, Klein looked at Miss Messenger who had been waiting. He asked with a chortle, How did you know that I'll be replying? One of Rionette Tinker's heads succinctly answered, Inkling. Right on the heels of that, the 4 blonde red-eyed heads spoke one after another. You seem a little livelier. Recently, your expression has also become much richer. As Klein pulled out the box that was connected to his golden pocket watch, he took out a gold coin from it and said with a self-deprecating smile, repeatedly wearing a thick mask isn't good for one's mental health. I realized that after becoming a demigod. Therefore, unless he was in situations where he needed to disguise or hide his feelings, he limited the use of his clown's power to control his emotions. Rionette Tinker didn't say a word as the heads bit on the gold coin and letter before vanishing.
Watching Miss Messenger leave, Klein leaned back slightly and inwardly muttered, I wonder if Miss Sharon and Marek will use the Sanguine to deal with the Rose School of Thought members in Backland.
Miss Sharon is probably focusing her time and efforts on her advancement. She might not involve herself, but I can't be sure about Marek. Emlyn changed into his Church of Earth Mother priest robes, and then wore a red coat and a silk hat before walking out the Harvest Church. He then got into a rental carriage by the roadside.
After saying his destination, he casually cast his gaze out the window.
At this moment, Emlyn sensed something as he abruptly moved his body, leaving shadowy afterimages in his wake as he moved to the side. Then, he saw a figure appear out of nowhere. It was a young man whose coat wasn't buttoned, revealing the white shirt and black vest within. His brown hair was a little moist and messy as though he hadn't combed it in a while. His brown eyes were filled with temperance, as though he was restraining certain urges deep within his heart. Upon seeing this pale corpse-like face, Emlyn tipped his chin and said with a smile, showing no signs of nervousness, You have finally come.
Aren't you afraid that I'm a member of the Rose School of Thought that's here to finish you off?
The young man's figure turned somewhat transparent.
Emlyn scoffed and said, Would I not be aware of the Rose School of Thought's history?
Or matters about the betrayal of the Temperance faction and their escape? Well, how do I address you?
Marek, the young man replied.
Is this the information you received from the upper echelons of the Sanguine? Emlyn was taken aback as he'd scared.
You are smarter than I thought.
He used such a remark to confirm the other party's guess. Marek slowly drew a breath and leaned forward slightly. How did you notice our existence from Ian's side? Emlyn leisurely leaned back into the carriage and said with a smile, Humans have the smell of humans. Wraiths have the smell of wraiths.
Marek fell silent for a few seconds before asking, You Sanguine wish to deal with the Rose School of Thought members in Backland?
The important members, Emlyn replied by making an emphasis. If that's the case, we can use ourselves as bait to help you fish out the Rose School of Thought members. However, I need confirmation.
Marek rubbed his eyes and said directly, I know you are unable to make the decision.
You can first return to seek permission from the Sanguine. After you obtain their assurance, you know where to find us. Having said that, he handed a dossier in his hand. This is from Ian. It's the initial feedback from tracking Ernst Boyar. Many bounty hunters have completed this together.
Emlyn received the dossier and nodded in a rare look of solemnity.
Okay.
Chapter 1001 First movement. When the wraith in front of him was gone, Emlyn White retracted his gaze, untied the thread on the dossier, and pulled out the documents inside. As he read through them, Emlyn had a rough idea of Ernst Boyar's routine. This Sanguine Viscount had a routine which was rather random, staying at home, out visiting exhibitions, partaking in wine tasting at manors in the city outskirts, shopping at department stores with female companions, or sketching female models. He was like the typical wealthy man. However, Ernst had recently been visiting St. George Borough every other day to monitor the renovations of the furniture factory he had invested in. It was a bid to ensure that it could quickly resume work. This way, the Sanguine Viscount's lifestyle became repetitive. The places he visited, the paths he took, and the places he had lunch were repeated every other day. Emlyn pressed down on his temples, seriously filtering out 3 venues which were suitable for the operation. The first was inside or at the entrance of the furniture factory owned by Ernst Boyar. The second was St. Hireland Square, where he stopped along the way home for a meal and to feed birds. The third place was Backland Bridge. Unless Ernst was willing to take a huge detour, he had to pass by this area when traveling between his home and St. George Borough. These 3 spots meet the requirement of having plenty of people, making it chaotic. However, Backland Bridge has too few entrances and exits. With the 2 ends locked down, one can only leave by jumping into the river, an act only chosen by idiots. St. Hireland Square comes under St. Hireland Cathedral, core to the Church of Steam in Backland, and even the entirety of Lone. It's akin to the Second Holy See. It meets Mr. Hanged Man's suggestion. It can effectively prevent conflicts from escalating, and it can interfere with any subsequent divination and investigations. Emlyn gradually had an inclination. And once a living being had an inclination, they would unknowingly seek more reasons to affirm their choice, and Emlyn was no exception, without a doubt. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that St. Hireland Square met almost all the requirements. First, Ernst wouldn't stay in the area for too long. He would have lunch at a restaurant with Civilau's cuisine since he was born in Civilau's county. Secondly, there were several tracked carriage stops in the vicinity, making the area filled with traffic on foot. With most of them being people from the lower or middle class, accidents often happened. Thirdly, with it as the origin, one would enter the area south of the bridge if one didn't head to the Backlund Bridge. It would then be close by to the Harvest Church. Finally, at noon, the St. Hireland Cathedral would spew steam, turn its levers, and chime a clock. It was inevitable for everyone's attention to be attracted. It's confirmed. Emlyn quickly made up his mind. Raising his right hand and adjusting his bow tie, his red eyes were filled with anticipation. At this moment, he suddenly frowned, sensing that something wasn't right. St. Hireland Square was just perfect for the job. It was so suitable that almost all the conditions were met. Will Ernst be wary against my revenge? Why would he allow himself to stay in such an environment for such long periods of time? Even if he's stupid enough to not realize it, wouldn't the Earls warn him? The corners of Emlyn's mouth curled up slightly as he understood the reason. St. Hireland Square was the venue the sanguine upper echelons had designated for him. Heh! Emlyn chuckled, keeping his mouth curled. He decided to request Mr. Fool to have a gathering for the few members and also invite Mr. Hanged Man to discuss the plan in detail. This was different from the framework that they had previously decided upon. They needed to consider every detail and consider every problem. At 15 minutes to 12, St. George Borough, St. Hireland Square. In a private room on the third story of a restaurant northwest of the square. A figure stood in front of the window, holding a cup filled with scarlet blood-like liquid. He was leisurely looking at the fountain nearby and the crowds that came and went. He was a lanky person, wearing a formal suit meant for banquets. His light-colored hair that was nearly silver and his bright red eyes combined together to give him a sense of coquettish handsomeness. There was a constant faint smile lining his lips. "My lord, will it really be fine?" Emlyn seems to be different from before. This can be seen from his recent hunt of the primordial moon believers. A middle-aged man in a dark suit walked to the window and said with some hint of worry. The man who had been politely addressed cast his gaze at the square where Emlyn White stood. He was listening to a violinist busking on the street as he chuckled. "Our preparations are enough even against a demigod, much less a kid who hasn't even become a viscount. Besides, we don't really plan on doing anything serious. Our only goal is to identify and make confirmations. This is a lot simpler than preventing certain people from escaping." As he spoke, the man with the light hair and bright red eyes raised his right hand slightly, rotating the ring on his left ring finger. The ring was made of silver, and embedded in it was a strange gem with a ghostly blue hue. On a carriage driving towards St. Hireland Square, Ernst Boyar had his right hand over his left. He naturally rotated the ring on his ring finger that had a ghostly blue gem embedded in it. He casually looked out the window and saw a trackless carriage slowly drive over from afar. A paperboy slightly taller than 160 centimeters had a sling bag across his chest as he peddled his papers along the street. Quite a number of bicycles had replaced the carriages that were often seen last year. They darted through the crowds in St. George Borough. Here, the number of workers wearing light blue or grayish-blue uniforms with hats had far exceeded the number of people in formal suits and top hats. Ernst retracted his gaze as he chuckled. He had no fear about what would happen next. He even looked forward to it. He believed that he had made enough preparations. He wore Oath of Rose on his left hand. It allowed him to share what he saw, heard, and smelled with Earl Mistral from a distance away. It made sure that nothing would go wrong while ensuring that their objective was met. In his inner pocket where his silver pocket watch was, there was a moon paper figurine. These could suffer a single lethal blow or an attack that targeted his sole body. It ensured that he wouldn't suffer any serious injuries or death within a short span of time. He also wore Alcohol Nemesis, a diamond brooch. It kept him brimming with energy with lucidity in his thoughts. It raised his resistance against spells that acted on the body of heart and mind. By his waist was a belt named Moonlight Sash. It could effectively reduce sun and lightning damage. These mystical items were the accumulation of Ernst's wealth or were bestowed by Earl Mistral. It made sure that Ernst was a target that could hardly be quickly finished off or controlled.
With the Sanguine Viscount's natural resistance against nightmare-type influences, Ernst was nearly without weakness. Even against a demigod, he could put up a fight as long as the latter didn't reveal their mythical creature form. The only problem is that the negative effects of all these mystical items are quite excessive. Ernst's facial muscles twitched, but he quickly composed himself. The Oath of Rose would make his thoughts appear in Earl Mistral's mind from time to time. And if he kept wearing it for a week without removing it, the pair who had the matching rings might very well end up in love, regardless of gender or race. Moon paper figurine was an expendable item. It had nearly zero side effects apart from making the body slightly cold. The alcohol nemesis brooch's problem was that it would deal continuous damage to one's liver and brain. If it was worn for excessively long periods of time, it might result in one losing one's thoughts and logical reasoning. Therefore, one had to take it off for 15 minutes after every half an hour of equipping it. Once Moonlight Sash was worn, it made all senses much sharper, making it easy for one to see and hear things one shouldn't see or hear. At the same time, the wearer would feel itchy at intermittent intervals. Let's hope they don't cower in fear and that this doesn't drag on. Ernst Boyar checked on his condition once again, casting his gaze of anticipation at the St. Hireland Square's entrance nearby. On the other end of St. Hireland Square, Emlyn White, who was taking in the sights of the buskers on the streets, suddenly looked up at a bird that flew over. Following that, he raised his hand to press down on his top hat. Bowing his head slightly, he briskly walked to the middle of the square, approaching the fountain. In this process, Emlyn's figure kept moving as he mixed into the crowd. However, this failed to avoid Earl Mistral's tracking. This sanguine earl with silver hair rotated the ghostly blue gem ring on his left ring finger and coldly said, "Take note." At the entrance of St. Hireland Square, Ernst Boyar grew increasingly pumped. He knew that the operation was about to come finally. Emlyn still chose St. Hireland Square after all. Ernst cast his gaze out the window once more, warily watching the pedestrians on the street, the trackless public carriages that were about to pass him, the ordinary paperboy who was peddling his papers, and the elegant windows of the surrounding houses and shops. He didn't believe that Emlyn's potential partners were hiding in there, because there were even more, better spots in St. Hireland Square that made it conducive to take action. However, he still kept up the required level of wariness. Suddenly, his body lunged forward slightly as he nearly got out of his seat. The carriage he was on had stopped without any warning. Right on the heels of that, the horses that pulled the carriage seemed to be in a nightmare as they raised their front hooves, struggling wildly, flipping the carriage to the ground. During this process, Ernst Boyar actually had ample space, time, and strength to help the carriage driver control the berserk horse. However, he didn't do so, because he saw a transparent wolf-shaped specter jump over from outside the window. It had thrown a rose within its body. A rose. Ernst Boyar's eyes widened as the carriage toppled. He hurriedly jumped to the side and out the carriage as he made an illusory and incorporeal black chain extend out of the void. It wrapped around the wolf-shaped specter. With a soft poof, the wolf-shaped specter dissipated without a struggle. And when Ernst Boyar found his footing, he stood there motionless, his eyes turbid. He had already been pulled into a deep sleep. In a trackless public carriage that passed him by, a black-haired, green-eyed young man wore a thin trench coat. His back was facing the middle of the street as he focused on reading a notebook with a green bronze hard cover. Around him, the other passengers were either reading the papers or chatting. Some were looking out only to see the berserk horse quickly recover. With a whoosh, the black-haired, green-eyed man flipped the page of the notebook. The trackless carriage continued forward and gradually distanced itself. Chapter 1002 Second Movement St. Hireland Square, in the northwestern corner, at the third story of a restaurant. When the wolf spectre with the rose appeared in front of Ernst Boyar, the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed Mistral retracted his gaze from Ernst Boyar. Darkness suffused from behind him as countless tiny bats flew within. Bribe. Just as this sanguine earl silently muttered the single word, he saw the toppled carriage, heard the neighing of the horse and smelled all kinds of smells. However, he wasn't able to instantly find the origin of the disturbance and accident. At this moment, his vision darkened as his eyes seemed to lose the ability to take in light. The din in his ears also halted. Earl Mistral chortled inwardly as he immediately fused with the bats behind him, rematerializing beside Ernst Boyar. Suddenly, in his black vision, a point of light appeared. This point of light rapidly expanded as it grew brighter and brighter. A golden figure with 12 pairs of pitch-black wings walked out of it. The pairs of wings spread out, blanketing Mistral's vision, causing light and darkness to mix. This created mysterious and complicated symbols that didn't differentiate themselves within the golden figure. It was both holy and corrupted, both light and dark. Angel. Mistral's pupils widened slightly as he couldn't help but take a step back, terminating his previous thoughts. In confusion, Ernst Boyar rapidly snapped awake when he saw a pair of limpid eyes that resembled crystalline gems or a lake. He felt a copy of the newspapers being stuffed into his hand. In those emerald-green eyes were ripples. Deep within the emanating ripples were twirls of a vortex that seemed to suck in the soul of anyone who lay their eyes on them. Ernst Boyar instantly became engrossed in it as he couldn't move his eyes away. Then, he heard a gentle and ethereal female voice in his ears. "Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White. Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White." This voice was layered as it resounded within Ernst Boyar's ears. It drilled into his brain, sinking deep into his heart. Ernst Boyar nodded in a daze, sensing that there was more, but he couldn't hear it clearly. The paperboy with a sling bag diagonally across his shoulders swiftly turned around and agilely passed through the bicycles, mixing into the crowd that came and went. This boy had a pretty face as his messy hair drooped down and hid his brows. As he walked, he took off a black fishnet glove that he had worn at some point in time, stuffing it into his sling bag filled with newspapers. As the wind blew, his clothes shrank as a spot on his exposed arm protruded out. A few seconds later, Ernst Boyar suddenly jumped back from where he stood, doing so as though he had been trying to dodge something. "No good. I was influenced by a nightmare's ability." Just as he found his footing, his pupils dilated as he looked around his surroundings in a state of high alert, prepared for any impending attacks. Although Ernst Boyar was perplexed about how easily he was pulled into a dream, he knew that it wasn't time to consider the details. What followed next was key. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Ring. A few bicycles passed him as they used their bells to warn the gentleman in the middle of the road to make way. Ernst Boyar narrowed his eyes as he glared at him, his muscles under his clothes ready to deliver their might. I.e., these few bicycles circled around him as the pedestrians came and went, some slowing down their footsteps and pointing their fingers. Gong, gong, gong. 12 gongs were heard as the white steam spewed out from the chimneys of St. Ireland Cathedral. The holy hymns of praise resounded as the gears and levers got to work. On the square, everyone stopped in their footsteps. At that holy moment, they either closed their eyes in prayer or were listening silently, regardless of whether they were believers of the god of steam and machinery or not. Only the pigeons that were being fed flew up and soared into the sky. Gong gong, gong. As the gongs sounded, no one moved. Even Earl Mistral, who was inside a private room at the restaurant, stood there motionless with a heavy expression. His vision had already recovered, but all he saw was workers wearing grayish-blue or light blue clothes and bicycles of the same make. Apart from that, he discovered nothing. Furthermore, Ernst Boyar hadn't been injured at all. Of course, he had guessed that the paperboy was problematic from the newspaper in the Sanguine Viscount's hand. However, he didn't attempt to carry out a pursuit. Clearly, the power that had borrowed the level of an angel didn't belong to a low or mid-sequence beyonder. This also meant that Emlyn White's faction had at least a demigod hidden in the vicinity. Mistral believed that once he took action, he was bound to be stopped or even incur retaliation. In a situation of being easily detected while not knowing where his opponents were hiding, Mistral believed that it spelled trouble. Carrying out a pursuit in such cases only exacerbated the matter. Furthermore, to the Sanguine, this was only a test. If the faction backing Emlyn had mobilized a demigod, they could detain that powerhouse thanks to Ernst Boyar's protective measures. And through Oath of Rose, Mistral could confirm the attacker's identity. They had never thought of escalating the matter into an intense conflict. In their plans, it only involved Earl Mistral stopping the other party to prevent Ernst Boyar from suffering any harm. In the present situation, they had lost the initiative. To forcefully carry out a pursuit might highly likely result in a demigod's battle. And in Backlund, around St. Ireland Cathedral, this was equivalent to suicide. Besides, to Mistral, since the other demigod hadn't personally taken action and had only provided auxiliary help, to personally take action and make a pursuit would be a loss of decorum and an insult to his reputation as a sanguine earl. Humph! I want to see what happens next. Mistral's facial muscles twitched as he rotated the ghostly blue ring on his left hand once more. After the 12 gongs, Emlyn started walking again. He circled past the fountain and arrived at the other end of St. Hireland Square amidst the landing pigeons. He then saw Ernst Boyar, who had his back hunched slightly, afraid to even move half a step. He saw the toppled carriage, the horse that was flicking its tail, and the carriage driver who wore a look of pain. Emlyn walked over, took out a wallet, and pulled out £100. He handed it to the carriage driver and said, "This is your compensation." Ah! The carriage driver wore a blank but pleasantly surprised look. The rental carriage wasn't his. He was only an ordinary employee. After the carriage was damaged because of the horse being startled, he experienced a brief moment of feeling the pinch. Following that, it was anxiousness and despair that ruled over his mind. Based on the so-called contract and other similar accidents he had seen over the years, he was responsible for all of this. This meant compensation from him and, with his income and family situation, meant bankruptcy. During that short moment, all kinds of thoughts had surfaced in the carriage driver's mind. They were mainly of 3 types. One was to scare the frozen gentleman and get him to pay compensation. This prevented his family from falling apart, with his children having to slave away at the factories at a young age. Another option was to immediately bring the horse to a gangster and sell it. Then, he would return home and leave Backlund with his wife and children. The last option was to arrange for his family to move from the place they rented. He would then plead with the owner of the carriage, hoping that he could repay it in installments. If the person wasn't agreeable, he would rather be thrown into jail than reimburse him a single penny. Now, having £100 suddenly hit him left his mind groggy. He was at a loss for words. £100 was enough to buy a brand new rental carriage and even more. Emlyn ignored the carriage driver and looked at Ernst. "Everything's fine now. Aren't you the biggest problem? How can it be fine with you here?" Ernst lampooned as he rotated the ring with the ghostly blue gem on his left hand. For some unknown reason, he felt that he should believe Emlyn White and even approach him. Emlyn shot a glance, suddenly turned around, and walked briskly into an alley. Ernst subconsciously opened up his stride and followed closely behind. He kept holding on to the newspaper in hand. The 2 sanguine moved at extremely fast speeds, with one running and the other chasing. However, they didn't dare reveal anything extraordinary. When Earl Mistral sensed that the 2 sanguine were beyond the reach of his spirituality, he used the connection between the paired oath of rose rings to follow behind unhurriedly. Emlyn occasionally made detours, taking shortcuts and occasionally returning to spots they had been before. It made it difficult to guess where his destination was. As for Ernst, he was like a bull having seen a red cloth. He refused to give up as he followed closely behind. Unknowingly, the 2 sanguine arrived at Rose Street, which was south of the bridge. At this moment, Emlyn suddenly sped up. He wasn't afraid that others saw him producing after images as he dashed right into the Harvest Church. Ernst did the same. Not good. From afar, Earl Mistral was just about to descend upon them to stop the subsequent developments when Ernst's figure vanished inside the Harvest Church's entrance. Gotcha! A tile at Mistral's foot instantly shattered. After entering the cathedral, Ernst came to a realization. He then saw a figure wearing a brown priest robe stand up at the front of all the rows of pews. He appeared like a mountain. At the same time, the entire cathedral turned heavy as if it was a jail. It seemed to fuse with the land itself. Ernst's mind buzzed immediately as another voice sounded in his mind. "After you awaken from the first hypnosis, throw all the items on you to Emlyn White." Amidst shuffling sounds, Ernst took off his sash, threw out the brooch, and slammed the various items towards Emlyn White. This included his silver pocket watch and a wallet filled with cash. Pah! The newspaper in his hand fell to the ground, throwing out a paper card that was stuffed within. On the paper card was the goddess of justice sitting on a chair and holding a sword and scale. It was the tarot card, Justice. Chapter 1003. Ritornello. After throwing everything other than his clothes, Ernst Boyar was stunned for a moment before he snapped to his senses. "What am I doing? What did I do?" This sanguine viscount finally recalled the matters he had deliberately forgotten. Those pair of emerald green limpid eyes. A psychological cue, no, hypnosis. Ernst Boyar looked around in anger and irresistible horror, instinctively taking in the situation he was in. His gaze then landed on the mountain-like figure. He saw Father Yutravsky with his thin and sparse brows. Instantly, Ernst Boyar had all sorts of thoughts run through his mind and collide with one another. He quickly came up with one intense thought. He didn't put up any resistance, and he immediately said, "I'll come here to do a month of volunteer work." Emlen's predicament had long been spread amongst the sanguine in Backlund.
Ernst Boyar was well aware of Father Yutravsky and knew that, even if he were to put up a fight, it was difficult for him to escape the fate of doing volunteer work.
He might as well surrender and choose conditions that were more beneficial to him. At the very least, I shouldn't have any cues planted in my mind and end up converting my faith to Earth Mother. This thought flashed through Ernst's mind.
He discovered a lantern in Yutravsky's hand, and inside it was a strange candle that seemed to be covered in human skin with protruding lumps.
Under the candlelight's faint illumination, Ernst's pupils widened again. He only had one thought on his mind remaining as it kept resonating. Another psychological cue. At that moment, he felt the gloominess thicken in his heart. "All right," Yutravsky nodded and agreed to Ernst Boyar's request.
Emlen held back his smugness and pleased smile. He then looked at the items he had caught, looking like a farmer who had just reaped a bountiful harvest.
In a private room on the third story of a restaurant northwest of the square, the lights darkened as a huge shadow appeared. Tiny bats flew out of the darkness and quickly clumped together.
Smoke rose up as the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed Earl Mistral appeared at the spot where the bats had appeared.
Everything around him had been restored to normal.
His servant, a middle-aged man in a dark formal suit, immediately stepped forward and asked with a bow, "My lord, are you having your meal now?"
He couldn't tell if things had happened smoothly, or if something had gone wrong, much less about the success of the outcome from the Earl's face. However, he didn't dare inquire.
Mistral nodded and said, "Yes."
He walked to the table with a composed look, took off the ring with the ghostly blue gem, and sat down without showing a chink in his disposition.
It was as though he had headed out to feed the pigeons.
This rich smell is rather unique, but it's not bad.
In the private room neighboring Earl Mistral, Klein was wearing a very ordinary face as he commented on the Civilau's cuisine delicacy, lamb tripe.
This punishment operation was an attempt by the few members of the Tarot Club, one that didn't need the world or Mr. Fool's interference, but considering how Miss Justice and the Moon Emlyn had zero experience in such matters and lacked experience in other matters, he had come to the area incognito as a final safeguard. He had previously used his marionette to pray to the Fool while he entered the attached bathroom of his private room to head above the grey fog. Using the corresponding point of light, he had taken in the entire square and its surroundings. He kept holding the sea god's scepter the entire time, prepared to deliver a lightning strike to prevent any problems once he discovered anything amiss. However, he ultimately didn't do a thing. Everything happened more smoothly than he imagined. There was no need for him to consider the experience the Star Leonard, but Miss Justice, who was participating in such matters for the first time, had exceeded his expectations. She wasn't nervous at all, not showing any signs of panic. Indeed, a sequence 6 of the spectator pathway is far greater than low and mid-sequence beyonders of the other pathways when it comes to controlling emotions. Even if she felt uneasy, she would have resolved it with her beyonder powers before the operation. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he continued sampling the other delicacies. Outside the window on St. Ireland Square, it became filled with lively music, an eclectic mix of the flute, violin, accordion, and 7-string guitar. A rental carriage was slowly circling around the perimeter of St. Ireland Square. Leonard Mitchell, who was prepared to return to the north bank of the Backlund Bridge, took one look at the pigeons in the middle of the square before asking with a suppressed voice, "Old man, what's your take regarding the outcome of this operation?" After he pulled Ernst Boyar into a dream, he flipped Lamino's travels and activated Angel's Embrace. He then left the scene on carriage, unsure of the subsequent developments. In his mind, Pallas Zoroast snapped back. In the fourth epoch, there's such a saying, believe in the might of deities. This means that this matter has received the tacit approval of Mr. Fool, so it's bound to succeed? However, Old Man doesn't know much about the Tarot Club. Mr. Fool is a witness most of the time, so there's no so-called tacit approval. Leonard mumbled inwardly before diverting the topic. Why doesn't this saying feel complete? He had never informed Pallas Zoroast of the exact situation of the Tarot Club. All he did was give mention of the general situation of the Tarot Club and inform him of the matters that had been approved by Mr. Fool. Pallas chuckled and said, "Indeed.
There's also a second half of the saying, do not trust their benevolence. Believe in the might of deities, but do not trust their benevolence. Leonard repeated in silence as he looked down at the notebook with a bronze hardcover. He then muttered wistfully, this is really akin to a Grade 1 sealed artifact. Furthermore, resolving its negative effects is relatively simple. Before this operation, consideration was given to the fact that beyonders of the pathway involving the moon domain, as well as the darkness, had relatively stronger resistance against nightmare-related effects. Leonard had originally planned on borrowing Creeping Hunger from the world Klein Moretti. However, after some subsequent discussion, Miss Magician mentioned the traits of Lamino's travels, giving him a better option. Hence, Klein, who was originally responsible for Angel's Embrace, lent him Creeping Hunger for 3 hours. Various useful Beyonder powers were recorded, such as Bribe, Weaken. This is something from the Abraham family, Palaz Zoroast said with a sigh. Leonard had long known of this as he nodded indiscernibly.
He then asked, Old man, do you have the means of weakening or controlling the negative effects of the mystical item I previously mentioned? You call that a mystical item? That's something that requires sealing. Palaz first reprimanded Leonard. Then he said, didn't you say that it has a living characteristic?
That makes it much easier to resolve. Leonard felt relieved as he cast his gaze out the window again, taking in the sight of St. Hireland Cathedral, which had parts resembling factories.
In Phelps Street, North Borough, in the vicinity of St. Samuel Cathedral, at the entrance of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. After changing her clothes, Audrey got off a carriage like an ordinary girl. She had already gotten rid of her paperboy attire at a hotel room that had been prepared ahead of time. And that room was reserved by someone under Emlyn's instructions. It had nothing to do with her. At this moment, there were people coming and going at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation's entrance, but Audrey walked over without any hesitation. No one looked at her, as though she lived in another world. Audrey briskly walked into the foyer, went up to the second story, and headed for the director's office. And everyone who she walked past seemed to join her in playing a game, pretending as though they hadn't seen her. They weren't puzzled about why this unfamiliar girl was inside. Audrey was just about to enter the office when she suddenly heard a familiar voice inside. Miss Audrey, this is the amount of donations we have gathered this week. Audrey couldn't help but curl the ends of her lips as she gently nudged the ajar door and walked in. Inside the office, a staff member was holding a stack of documents, showing it to the person behind the desk. Sitting behind the desk was a golden retriever with a pair of gold-rimmed glasses hanging by her neck. It sat at the director's seat, casually flipping through the documents, and said, "That wouldn't be an issue." The staff member then took back the document and smiled at the golden retriever. "Then, I'll take my leave, Miss Audrey." Behind her, Audrey held back her laughter as she walked to the sofa. She silently watched the staff member leave without interrupting the golden retriever from reading the other documents. Susie seriously read the different documents, afraid that something wrong would happen to her acting, thus affecting Audrey's matters. After a while, she suddenly looked around in puzzlement. "Audrey, are you back? How did you notice?" Audrey stood up from the sofa and appeared within Susie's sights. For this operation, she had specially spoken to Susie. She got the latter to replace her at work in the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Then, with the golden retriever in tow, she hypnotized all the staff members who would interact with her that day, making them treat Susie as Audrey. As for any possible visitors, she told her staff that there would only be guests in the afternoon. And the signal to snap out of the hypnosis was the cathedral bells at 2 in the afternoon. Susie jumped off the chair after seeing Audrey, saying in exasperation, "It's almost 2. "That's right." Audrey inwardly made a silly face as she rushed into the small lounge and changed into her clothes. She then used Lai's flame-controlling powers to bum her previous disguise. After returning to her office and sitting at her seat, she felt completely relaxed. She clasped her hands together and lightly pursed her lips. To be frank, she had always been nervous. However, she had successfully cast Placate on herself before the operation, preventing any slip-ups. It's quite interesting now that I reminisce over it. We even discussed how we would compensate those who were affected. Audrey, well done. A smile beamed on the blonde, green-eyed beauty as it grew brighter. After this operation, she realized that her hypnotist potion had digested by a significant amount. Furthermore, she had also confirmed one thing. The mystical item, Hand of Horror, which came with bribe, charm worked perfectly with hypnosis. Yes, I also learned that Mr. Moon's name is Emlyn White. He didn't bother hiding the matter, because he had to tell me. Otherwise, we wouldn't have achieved our goals. Yes. Perhaps just giving the name of the cathedral was enough, but that will still expose his identity. I'm still feeling some anxiety. I was too stiff when hypnotizing. I actually used words that were too direct during the first level of hypnosis. Audrey cast placate on her slightly agitated feelings as she reviewed the entire operation, hoping that she could draw from the experience and lessons of today. Gong. Gong. St. Samuel Cathedral's bells chimed, indicating that it was 2 in the afternoon. Many staff who were inside 22 Phelps Street at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation had their bodies tremble after hearing it. Following that, they continued with their work as though nothing had happened. Gong. Gong. Amidst the cathedral's bells, Klein, who had transformed back into Dwayne Dantes, once again walked to 160 Buckland Street's balcony and took in the situation of Mock's house. At this moment, a carriage passed by his residence's entrance and drove to the end of the street. Suddenly, Klein felt his perception trigger as a scene surfaced in his mind. A gray rat was leaning against the carriage's window, leisurely watching the street scenery. Chapter 1004 Third Movement Gray Rat. Klein's eyelids twitched as he didn't hesitate to turn back into his half-open room, leave the balcony, and enter the master bedroom. He then entered the bathroom. He moved at an adequate pace, doing so as though he had been repeating this entire process like a daily routine. Locking the bathroom's door, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and passed through the gray fog filled with ravings and roars, finally taking his seat on the high-backed chair of the fool. And before this, he made his valet, Enuni, who was standing by the corridor, softly pray to sea god Calvetua. Using the corresponding point of light, he beckoned for the sea god's scepter and began expanding his vision. He then locked onto the carriage that was driving towards Mock's residence, 39 Buckland Street. And this time, the person leaning against the glass window and leisurely taking in the scenery was no longer a gray rat but a young man wearing a silk top hat and black trench coat. He had black hair and black eyes. His face was thin with a broad forehead. He wore a crystal monocle and had a faint smile on his lips. He was none other than the blasphemer, the angel of time, son of the creator, Amon. Although Klein was already mentally prepared, his anxiety made his entire body feel chilly. Amon had clearly appeared in his original form, but after stealing the rat demigod's destiny, he appeared as a gray rat in everyone's eyes without incurring any suspicion. He and his brother, Angel of Imagination Adam, had certain powers which were similar. It left terror in the mind of others the more they thought about it, but it was intrinsically different. If not for the gray fog and not for my deeper control of this place, I wouldn't have discovered it either. Klein felt a mix of joy and alarm as he expanded his vision to seek out Amon's avatars. Compared to the grafting of destiny, the signs of parasitizing was a lot clearer. However, Klein didn't notice anything this time. Be it the other passengers in the carriage, the horses that towed the carriage, or the surrounding trees and air, there wasn't any sign of parasitizing. This is different from what Leonard's grandpa said. Shouldn't the appearance of one Amon mean the accompaniment of many more Amons? He is clearly aware that he was discovered by a bizarro sorcerer of the Church of Evernight, and he suspects that Buckland Street is under surveillance. Therefore, he only sent a single avatar to investigate the situation? Klein frowned as he came up with theories. He was a little unsure of how to handle the current development. Of course, he recalled Palaz Zoroast mentioning that as long as one avatar was resolved, he could eliminate all the Amons in Buckland Street. And now, there was only one Amon in Buckland Street, a perfect time to take action. I'll first hear what the expert's opinion is. Klein immediately conjured the World Gairman Sparrow's figure at the other end of the long bronze table, and made him reverently and piously pray. Honorable Mr. Fool, please inform Leonard Mitchell that Amon has appeared at 39 Buckland Street, but there's only one. While Gairman Sparrow made the prayer, Klein didn't stop monitoring the carriage. He saw Hazel in a light-colored dress alight and enter her foyer. Amon, who was wearing a monocle and black trench coat, walked behind her with complete composure. Despite not having any concealment, the servants didn't notice him at all. It was as though there was only air or some inconspicuous creature behind Miss Hazel. Occasionally, the female servants would look at the ground and jump in fright. Just as they were about to scream, they would forget what they were about to do after their mouths opened. Amon passed through the foyer and walked up the stairs. Pinching the crystal monocle, Amon stuffed his hands into his pockets. Ringed transparent worms began squirming out of his body as they crawled in every direction before vanishing. This left Klein's scalp tingling. He recalled Palaz Zorost's description of Amon's parasitizing power, a plague-like infection. Hazel had been in an excellent mood recently. This was because her teacher hadn't truly gone mad. Everything that happened previously was only a test, and she had passed it with flying colors. This made her gain plenty of knowledge about the supernatural world. She learned the essence of the potions and grasped the acting method. She also gained the opportunity to advance to cryptologist. She was currently a Sequence 7 Beyonder. So the world actually has such a magical side to it. I wonder when I can become a demigod and shake off my mortal coils. Hazel glanced at the hanging wall clock and rubbed her sunken tummy. She decided to get her mother to bring forward the high tea session today. After all, there weren't any guests. At noon, she had used the excuse of heading out for a meal to bring her teacher back. She also took the opportunity to act and hadn't had anything to eat. Upon thinking that, she glanced at her teacher who was sprawled on a leather cushion on the sofa. The gray rat had raised its front paw and pressed on its right eye. "Do you need any food?" Hazel asked reverently.
The rat lowered its front paw and answered unhurriedly, "There's no need."
"All right, teacher." Hazel turned around and walked forward, opening the door to her bedroom. Her lady's maid was standing along the corridor, leisurely looking at the balcony at the end of the corridor as though she was admiring the afternoon sky. Hazel indiscernibly frowned and said, "God, this place. Don't let anyone in." The lady's maid shot one glance at her and smiled. "Yes, Mississippi." Only then did Hazel leave her bedroom and head for the activity room on the second story. She found her mother, Ma'am Rihanna. This lady with the same black-green hair received a pair of gem-embedded glasses with a gold chain hanging from it from her lady's maid. It was more an accessory than an eyesight correction tool. "Don't tell me that you don't like it?" Hazel asked in puzzlement. The corners of Ma'am Rihanna's mouth curled slightly. "I like it now." As she said that, she wore the glasses. As Hazel was just about to say something, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned her head to find her father, Member of Parliament mocked, coming home early. "Father, didn't you say that you'd be at the military veterans mess?" Hazel asked in passing. "There wasn't anyone there today." Mocked raised his right hand and pinched the two sides of his eyes. Hazel thought nothing of it as she nodded. "Perfect. We haven't had high tea together in a long time." "That's right." Member of Parliament mocked and Ma'am Rihanna laughed at the same time as a faint smile appeared on their lips. At 7 Pinster Street, Leonard, who had just returned from St. Ireland Square, threw himself onto the sofa as he lifted his feet onto the coffee table. Having not received any information, he believed that the punishment operation had come to a perfect end, allowing him to look forward to the spoils of war. "Old man, didn't you say that the Sanguine Viscount had many mystical items on him? Can you tell me what they are?" Leonard softly asked in puzzlement. In his mind, Palaz Zorost harumphed. "Items of that level aren't worth my notice." Leonard was just about to press further when his vision suddenly blurred. He saw the boundless grayish-white fog and Gairman Sparrow's blurry figure, as well as his prayer. "Amon has appeared at 39 Buckland Street, but there's only one." "Amon has appeared? That quickly?" Leonard, who had already relaxed, retracted his feet immediately and sat straight up. He became more anxious than before the punishment operation began. He hurriedly informed Palaz Zorost of Klein's words and asked, "Old man, what do we do now?" "Begin the operation? But there's only one Amon avatar." Palaz Zorost fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "If there's only one Amon, it implies that he has other motives, but none of that matters. In the 4th epoch, there's a saying, there's no point crying over spilled milk. Since it has begun, we can't falter. If we delay this any further, Amon will attempt to influence the entire street. When that happens, he will definitely discover Dwayne Dantes' abnormality." Klein returned to the real world and walked out of the bathroom. He had already made the corresponding preparations. He had creeping hunger on his left hand and an emblem carved from obsidian in his right. Then he made Anuni snap his fingers and use flaming jump to enter 39 Buckland Street, Member of Parliament Mock's house, with the appearance of Gairman Sparrow. Control of the spirit body threads was instantly transferred to Klein, but this only seemed to sink into the vast ocean without any reaction. He had lost control of his marionette. This. Klein's eyelid twitched as he heard the door to the master bedroom creak open. It was Anuni. This youth with Lone and Balam blood in him had pushed open the door and walked in, completely outside of Klein's control. He then took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and rubbed it with his sleeve. Then, he leisurely wore it on his right eye. He then looked at Dwayne Dantes, the corners of his mouth curling up. Found you.
The mood in the bedroom froze as Anuni, who was pinching on the monocle, continued. Flora Jacobs' destiny was filled with too many abnormalities, and they mainly came from this street.
This piqued my interest, and I spent some time to distinguish and seek out the source. It took me so many days to find you. I'm no stranger to this mirror, and I can control it, but I've never seen it ingratiate itself so much towards one person. This really is an interesting matter. Perhaps, I should steal your destiny and see why that is the case? Ah, right. You likely do not know of its origins. It's in no way simple.
To a bizarro sorcerer, battles like this, where he stalled for time and exerted his influence in secret, should have been something he was best at and something he enjoyed the most. Unfortunately, he had encountered Blasphemer Amon, the current pinnacle existence of the Marauder pathway. Even if he was only facing an avatar, he could do nothing about him. Klein actually suspected that Amon's words were a ruse, but he wasn't able to see through it. He didn't dare take the risk. During such times, he needed the help of a spectator. For you to say so much, I doubt it's solely to think of the means to parasitize me, right? You should know that before severely injuring me, it's very difficult to parasitize a bizarro sorcerer who can see spirit body threads, Klein calmly said as he wore Gairman Sparrow's face.
Amon immediately chortled. You finally noticed it. You're trying to steal my destiny? Klein swapped locations with a marionette once again, constantly making his actual body appear in different corners of the garden. No. Amon shook his head, keeping his hands in his pockets while leisurely saying with a smile, if a magic mirror like a Rhodes is willing to listen to your instructions and deliberately ingratiate itself towards you, it means that you aren't as simple as I imagined. I'm not a beyonder of the tyrant pathway, so I wouldn't be so rash as to directly steal your destiny. Haha, I suddenly have a feeling that directly replacing you would result in something I don't wish to see happening. How did you know a Rhodes is ingratiating itself? Flora Jacobs' destiny shouldn't have something like that. Klein appeared on a tree. His different marionettes continued changing their locations.
Amon pulled out one hand and pinched his chin and said, Didn't I say why?
I spent time to gather information and seek out the source. Oh, I went to the Church of Steam and had a chat with a Rhodes. It wasn't too frank, and it was willing to be tortured by me rather than reveal your true origins.
Unfortunately, that was inside the Church of Steam. Otherwise, I would have directly parasitized it and learn of everything.
Even living sealed artifacts can be parasitized? If a Rhodes strictly abided by the rules, based on its answers in the past, he isn't too sure of my actual situation and only has certain guesses.
Klein's eyes widened. Just as he was about to say something, he heard Amon laugh and say, You really don't seem to be in a rush.
What are you waiting for? Do you not know that my Pathways Sequence 2's name is Trojan Horse of Destiny? Although I'm only an ordinary avatar, I do have some powers that I can use, such as tinkering with your destiny, making certain errors appear for a certain period of time. For instance, no one will notice it no matter how much you cry for help.
Heh, that also means that, even if you were to trigger the Evernight emblem in your hand, you will only be able to get the effects of concealment, and you will not be able to transmit your intentions of seeking help, regardless of your prior agreements.
Also, even if you were to shout for help or create an explosion, the pedestrians and servants in the room wouldn't be able to hear a thing. This is the reason why I was talking so much. For an ordinary avatar, certain matters take time. All right, it's your turn to answer my question. Klein didn't answer as he kept switching positions with his marionettes.
However, Amon kept appearing in front of him as they continued their conversation.
At this moment, he made one of his marionettes ask, Since you've already completed the controlling of destiny, why aren't you taking action?
You also seem to be waiting. Before this Gairman Sparrow, who was a thin paper figurine, could finish his sentence, there was a strong gust of wind from afar. Leonard, in a black trench coat and a black silver-inlaid cane in hand, flew to Buckland Street. Klein, who had appeared to Amon's side, immediately said, "This is what I've been waiting for." As he said that, he triggered the Evernight emblem that he had been clasping tightly. Simultaneously, he snapped his left hand's fingers, igniting the tallest tree in the garden, making its scarlet flames soar into the sky. And this huge, obvious bonfire, that would have been noticeable at a glance from across the street, was noticed by no one, be it the maids wiping the windows on the first story or the pedestrians strolling beneath the Intis parasol trees. Even in midair, Leonard Mitchell ignored this scene, rushing for 39 Buckland Street at high speeds. And at this moment, Pallas Zorost's slightly aged voice sounded in this red gloves' mind. "Turn back.
Head to Unit 160.
Although Leonard was puzzled, his experienced self didn't ask why when it came to supernatural matters. He immediately swung the direction word of the sea pointed and changed directions. In the garden of 160 Buckland Street, Amon raised his head as he pressed the crystal monocle on his right hand, chuckling. "This is also what I've been waiting for." He ignored Gairman's sparrow as his smile grew obvious. He continued speaking in irresistible delight. To be able to discover the abnormalities of fate in this region. "It's him, Pallas." As he spoke, this blasphemer changed his actions and adjusted his monocle. At this moment, a strange gloom fell over the entire street. It was as though the entire place had been separated from reality, turning into a secret. In the activity room of 39 Buckland Street, Hazel looked out the window and muttered in puzzlement, "Is it about to rain?" This wasn't anything important, so she retracted her gaze and reached out her hand onto the 3-layered tray for high tea. Then, she saw her father, Member of Parliament mocked, strangely open his right palm. Chapter 1006 finale and ending. It was an ordinary paper crane, bursting into scarlet-red flames just as it flew out, scattering ashes in the process. Amon, who had been looking up into the sky, suddenly turned his head and looked at the paper crane, who was a vessel of flames. He then raised his palm again. A cold glint had lit up in the eye beneath the monocle. Suddenly, the flames on the paper crane's surface vanished. Klein and his ability to swap locations with his marionette vanished. Likewise for flame controlling, flaming jump, and air cannon. In that instant, he had 6 beyond a power stolen, 4 of which were rather important ones. If Amon was able to make a few more thefts, then Klein might have even turned into an ordinary person. This was theft at the angel level. Amidst the extinguishing flames, the paper crane slowly floated. Backlund, Dr. Aaron's house, in a black pram. Wrapped in silver silk, Will Septon rubbed his mouth and eyes, grumbling, "Life is just so hard." Before he finished his sentence, he took out what looked like a cane from somewhere. It was embedded with clear gems. Pure bright light lit up, illuminating the calendar in the room clearly. Today was Tuesday 160 Buckland Street, inside Dwayne Dantes's garden. The paper crane, which was already charred and incomplete, suddenly froze in midair. Complicated chrome-colored symbols appeared out of it, instantly taking on the form of a huge, illusory, scaleless snake. The dense patterns and symbols on the surface of the gigantic silver snake formed a wheel that was connected to each other. Around each wheel were different symbols. With a sweep of the cold, bright red eyes, this giant serpent soared into the sky and stayed above Buckland Street. It curled its body and bit its own tail. Its shadow blanketed the entire street like a mysterious and ludicrous wheel. Suddenly, mocked, Rihanna, and several servants in 39 Buckland Street's activity room wiped the smiles from their faces. They raised their hands in unison, taking off the monocle on their faces, allowing the monocles to turn incorporeal in their hands before transforming into beams of light. Immediately following that, they wore their eye accessories once again and pinched their eye sockets, either leisurely looking out the window or returning to their former state. Hazel sat on the ground watching this scene. As she shook her head, feeling the world crumbling around her, she used her hands to hold her body up while rapidly retreating. The cold glimmer in Winner Anuni's eyes vanished. The crystalline monocle was left cooked, and he no longer wore that supercilious look. In addition, something in his body seemed to be extracted as a clear, thick, but transparent and mysterious worm of time took form above his head. And amidst concealment, this worm of time quickly transformed into a figure with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead and a thin face.
This wasn't time reversing itself on Buckland Street, because Klein and Leonard didn't suffer any of its effects.
It was Amon having his condition return to a few minutes prior to this.
Snake of Fate. Reboot. Although Willa Septon had predicted that there would be some changes in fate, things had happened slightly later.
However, his influence that descended from afar came in such a timely fashion.
In order to gain this Snake of Fate's help, Klein had not only fed him 5 different flavors of ice cream, but he had also agreed to further compensation. The outcome of their negotiation was that Klein had to think of the means to create at least 2 items that could allow Willa Septon to briefly regain some of his strength while in his weakened state. When Amon suffered this unexpected blow, Klein didn't hesitate and drew Death Knell. He cocked it, gently pushed the cylinder, and aimed it at his enemy. Bang! He staidly and decisively pulled Death Knell's trigger, shooting out the control spirit bullet he had long prepared. A black stream of light flashed out, striking the illusory Amon figure with the sharp bonnet and classic black robe, the Worm of Time. This was even thicker and clearer than all the Worms of Time Klein had previously seen before. The light scattered as Amon's figure quivered in midair and froze without being able to wear any expression. And at this moment, Leonard, who had already arrived overhead, followed Old Man's instructions. Standing on Word of the Sea, he floated in midair, slightly spread out his arms, and relaxed his spirit body. Both his green eyes immediately reflected a slightly gloomy, 12-ring transparent Worm of Time in each one of them. These 2 Worms of Time had their heads and tails connected together, forming a similar loop. As the loop slowly spun, they projected a huge ancient mottled illusion behind Leonard. This illusion looked like the surface of a wall clock carved from stone. There were 12 segments. Each segment was either grayish-white or bluish-black. They were clearly demarcated from each other, and the symbols were all different. With just one look, Klein had the feeling that life was speeding past him. Gong! A bell gong that seemed to travel across time from ancient history resounded through the spacious secret world. Everything before Klein seemed to slow down, including the Amon figure above Anuni. An indescribable invisible surge appeared, sweeping around that Amon figure before hurling it towards that huge illusory stone-carved wall clock. What was actually a Worm of Time, Amon's avatar with a monocle, suddenly extended a hand, aiming it at Gehrman Sparrow. Suddenly, Klein saw the skin on the back of his hand rapidly dry up as they wrinkled up, producing unobvious aged spots. The speed at which Amon's illusory figure was being pulled away slowed down, but the process couldn't be interrupted.